Okay, so today we are going to talk about one of my favorite philosophers. And I don't mean that I agree with everything he says by any stretch of the imagination, but I do mean that he is just lovely to read, especially if the philosophy you're used to reading is stuff like Immanuel Kant or even worse, John Rawls, who are just brilliant thinkers, but they write constantly as if they're constipated. I mean, that's really the only way that I can put it, I think. John Rawls in particular, I mean, it's awful. It is awful writing. And I give a salute to anyone who is able to actually get through any of his work without falling asleep or getting a headache. For the record, I literally fell asleep when I had to read Rawls when I was getting my master's. I had to read the entire Theory of Justice, which is a huge book. And I couldn't at first. I kept falling asleep. And then finally, because I was so behind on readings in class, I finally figured out that I had to stand while reading him. And I got through it that way, but it took a lot of trial and error and a lot of pain, frankly. Anyway, I mean that's a whole other thing. So let's get into it. So before Twitter, came along and made biting sarcasm mainstream, and before Richard Dawkins came along and turned an angry form of atheism into a social movement. And even before Jordan Peterson, began getting famous by bumbling his way through misreadings of philosophy texts, there was the original angry atheist troll, Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, it's difficult to overstate just how important and insightful and troubling and even downright frustrating Nietzsche can be, and in my opinion is. He's a notoriously unorthodox thinker. He eschews systematic treatises in favor of pithy, inflammatory, offensive often, and sometimes hilarious aphorisms. He's every bit as readable, essentially, as Kant is unreadable, or Rawls. Heaven forbid. But because it's so easy to get lost in his sublime use of language, it's equally easy to miss what he's actually saying. And indeed, there's one famous person who misread Nietzsche really quite badly. Actually, there are a few famous people who did that. And as you may have noticed, more than a few of these figures come from the far right of the political spectrum. And this brings me to a question that it always comes up, and should always come up in a class that devotes any time to Nietzsche. And that's the question of Nietzsche's politics. The question of where Nietzsche falls on the political spectrum is a hotly contested one. Is he a leftist? That is, does he prize equality over hierarchy? Or is he a right-winger? That is, does he value hierarchy and authority over equality? Traditionally, in my experience, if you ask a right-wing Nietzschean, they'll point to the very well-established facts that he loathed democracy and praised hierarchy as evidence that he is ultimately a right-wing thinker. And ask a leftist Nietzschean, and guess what? They'll claim that his atheism, his relativism, and his aversion to any final capital T truth, so to speak, makes him a leftist, at least in spirit, if, not necessarily in word. The truth is that Nietzsche's not going to be a slave to your labels, man. But if I can be serious for a second, My left-wing academic friends have a point. He was fiercely individualistic, and that's a quality quite frequently, and maybe more than a tad oversimplistically associated with the left. Furthermore, his skepticism towards any, final capital T truth informed a lot of mid 20th century French philosophy in particular, which was almost universally left wing. Though I really, really want to quickly emphasize that there is nothing inherently left wing about skepticism of truth. But that was the trend in left leaning French academic departments in the 70s, who really loved their Nietzsche. Furthermore, he was a truly fierce opponent of anti Semitism. He broke what was likely the most rewarding relationship of his entire life, which was his friendship to the composer, the German composer Richard Wagner, because Wagner was, among many other things, a virulent anti Semite. Nietzsche broke off contact with his sister, Elizabeth Fürster Nietzsche, because she went off to Paraguay with her husband to found a German ethno-state free from racial undesirables. So while anti-Semitism, don't misunderstand me, it's not a quality that is always confined to the right or to the left, even though it's more associated with the right thanks to Nazi Germany. It's worth mentioning here because he does write in ways that sound a little suspicious, frankly. You no doubt noticed this yourselves while reading the genealogy. There he writes at various points about Jewish hatred, and that's what gave birth to slave morality. And of course, slave morality, that sounds bad, right? And sure enough, he does have plenty of criticisms, no shortage of criticisms of Judaism as a religion and an ideology. But it's this desire to ask the question, hey, if it looks like a Nazi, if it goose steps like a Nazi, and I guess quacks like a Nazi, then isn't it a Nazi? That's a good question to ask. And the answer, I think, today is, well, yes. But I think we have to treat writings from the 19th century, even the late 19th century, a little differently. If you heard someone today speaking openly about Jewish this and Jewish that, and it's almost entirely negative, it would be entirely reasonable to assume that this person falls somewhere to the right of Attila the Hun on the political spectrum. But again, Nietzsche was writing in the late 19th century, well before the Nazis took over, in other words. And back then, his way of speaking wasn't so, associated with race hate. However, he was absolutely right-wing in a lot of significant ways. That fictional right-wing academic friend that I quoted at the beginning of this slide is absolutely right. Nietzsche did prize hierarchy, and he prized strength. He did loathe equality and democracy. And in that sense, he is absolutely and fundamentally a right-wing thinker. And I realize that this may strike the American ear as odd, since in this country, I think we tend to associate right-wing politics so strongly with religion. But that's actually a very narrow and frankly false misconception. Religion in general, and Christianity in particular, since I think that's the most relevant religion for us here in America, and especially in the Ozarks, has been utilized by the political right in America in ways that the American left has just always failed to utilize it, or not always, but for a long time. Now, okay, there's a good case to be made that America doesn't really have a left wing, and hasn't for over half a century, but that's another rant for another time. In any case, it has not always been true that um, that right-wingers in America or anywhere have a monopoly on religion, or that religion has a monopoly on being right-wing. And just to give you a brief idea of what I'm talking about, one of the foremost progressives of the early 1900s and late 1800s, I believe, was this guy named William Jennings Bryan. He's considered today one of America's great populists and orators. This guy was a progressive who would make Bernie Sanders blush. And yet, he was an incredibly religious man who actually went on to argue in the famous Scopes monkey trial against the teaching of evolution. This was another guy, in other words, who was, too big for your labels, man. Then there is Richard Spencer, the white nationalist, most famous probably for getting punched in the face, but also famous for throwing up Sieg Heils at a neo-Nazi conference. Now, Spencer calls himself a conservative. He identifies with the Republican Party, and he is an atheist. He's one who idolizes Nietzsche, as a matter of fact. All of this is to say that I think we have a very inadequate view of what constitutes left and right in this country. And the reality is that religion in general, and Christianity in particular, has given us as many progressives and, outright socialists and communists sometimes, as it has Jerry Falwell's and Mike Pence's. And atheism has given us plenty of Richard Spencers. Christianity knows no left or right. And once you understand this, I think you've got one less obstacle in your way on the journey to understanding Nietzsche. So, before we get into Nietzsche proper, I want to talk a bit about what the philosopher and historian Paul Ricoeur called the Masters of Suspicion. This was a group of 3 19th century philosophers, including Nietzsche, who agreed on pretty much nothing, but were nevertheless united by a sort of common modus operandi. So let's actually open up Ricoeur's text, why don't we? But after that. Okay. So let's look here at the outlined part. If we go back to the intention they had in common, the Masters of Suspicion, we find in it the decision to look upon the whole of consciousness, primarily as false consciousness. They thereby take up again, each in a different manner, the problem of the Cartesian doubt. Remember that from the very first class? To carry it to the very heart of the Cartesian stronghold. The philosopher trained in the school of Descartes knows that things are doubtful, that they are not such as they appear, but, crucially, he does not doubt that consciousness is such as it appears in itself, or to itself. In consciousness, meaning and consciousness of meaning coincide. Since Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud, this too has become doubtful. After the doubt about things, we have started to doubt consciousness itself. So think about what Descartes was doing with his method of doubt. He wanted to arrive at something certain, anything. So he used this methodological skepticism, you could really call it, by imagining an evil demon had fooled him about everything that he believed he knew, and clouded his senses with all this false sense data. And in the end, Descartes couldn't be certain of anything. Anything but one thing, of course. Descartes couldn't be fooled about the fact that he was thinking, the fact that he was conscious. So for Descartes, it seems there was at least one undeniable truth in this crazy old world. But what if consciousness itself were called into question. So does this mean the masters of suspicion are just skeptics on steroids? Definitely not. And Ricoeur tells us as much in the very next paragraph. These three masters of suspicion are not to be misunderstood, however, as three masters of skepticism. They are, assuredly, three great destroyers. But that of itself should not mislead us. Destruction, Heidegger says in Sein und Zeit, is a moment of every new foundation, including the destruction of religion, insofar as religion is, in Nietzsche's phrase, a Platonism for the people. It is beyond destruction that the question is posed as to what thought, reason, and even faith still signify. What this means is that Nietzsche and co. aren't merely saying, well, we just can't know if consciousness as we know it can be trusted. No, they are doing something much more radical than that. What they're saying is not only can what we call consciousness not be trusted, we don't even properly understand what consciousness even is. For Freud, what we think of as consciousness in reality masks a complex web of desires and ways of containing said desires, not to mention a whole sea of unconscious drives right below the surface. For Marx, consciousness was far from being something we can control or really be conscious of in everyday life, is in reality determined by the ideology of the ruling class, the capitalists, which is itself a product of a society's material or economic conditions. And as an aside, I've always thought that a good, albeit slightly oversimplistic way of beginning to understand Marx and Nietzsche are to see them as something very close to polar opposites. Marx, you may know as being the most important communist theorist, was very much someone that Nietzsche would have accused of propagating slave morality. And for his part, Marx would have found Nietzsche to be an insufferable example of the sort of nobility worship or really rich worship that capitalism is predicated on. And to be fair to both, neither would have been entirely correct in their estimation of the other. But they'd be close enough to, get in some pretty heated tweet battles if they were around today. Anyway, as for our boy Friedrich, he saw the ultimate root of behavior as being an unconscious drive he called the will to power. Now, Nietzsche never set out in any systematic fashion what the will to power was. Of course, he never set anything out in a systematic fashion, so this is not too surprising. But it's pretty clear from his writings what he was talking about. And to my mind, he describes it most clearly in section 13 of Beyond Good and Evil, which is another book of Nietzsche's that I have not assigned. You're welcome. And he defines it here, he defines the will to power as the desire to discharge one's strength. In other words, it's the drive to dominate, okay, but not in the sort of brutish way that you're probably thinking of it. For instance, it's possible to dominate through generosity. Think of it this way: the generosity of the truly generous is itself a manifestation of will to power. Because generosity it's an indicator of strength. If you're talking about generosity of spirit, it's an indicator of strength in spirit. If you're talking about, I think generosity is more commonly talked about today as generosity with money, that's an indicator of financial strength, financial dominance, and so forth. So please don't misunderstand Nietzsche as saying that, everyone's just a brute looking to bully others. The truth is a lot more subtle than that, as it often is, or even really usually is with Nietzsche. And the will to power is indeed fundamental for Nietzsche. In fact, he says it's more fundamental than the will to survive. And, maybe you think that that's a bit of a stretch, but if you can understand that he does think that, I think it's helpful for understanding the genealogy of morals in general. So how about that genealogy of morals then? As you may have noticed, this is not the kind of genealogy that your granddad uses on the computer machine that he makes you set up whenever you visit. However, that kind of genealogy can actually be quite useful for understanding the kind that Nietzsche is engaged in. So think about it this way. The genealogy software that your grandpap uses traces his genetic lineage, right? Well, the kind of genealogy that Nietzsche is engaged in traces the historical lineage of morality, how it developed over time, the factors that led to this development. It's like a conceptual genealogy. And what Nietzsche is trying to do is show what factors made what we think of today as morality. And he begins by doing what Nietzsche does best, which is making fun of people. Specifically, he makes fun of these English psychologists. He doesn't ever say who exactly he has in mind, but it's almost certainly people like this guy, Jeremy Bentham. And that's him right here. Or rather, it's his corpse, which he insisted in his will be put on display for future generations to enjoy. Don't worry, though, the head is fake, actually. The real head fell off ages ago. And Bentham is most notable as the inventor of the moral theory called utilitarianism. And utilitarianism is, as I mentioned in an earlier class, the moral theory that tells us that the morally correct action in any given situation is the action that maximizes utility, or happiness in normie speak, for the greatest number of people. And this leads us to some, pretty agreeable conclusions. Like if a scientist discovers the cure for a disease that's ravaging humankind, for instance, then he or she is, according to utilitarianism, morally obligated to share the cure with humanity at large, even if not doing so, like, for example, if they kept it secret and sold it for profit, would make him or her filthy rich. Of course, his particular brand of utilitarianism also tells us that if it meant saving the world, we should torture a small child to death. That's not what bothers Nietzsche about Bentham, though. Nietzsche thought it was just, dumb to pursue happiness for its own sake. I mean, pigs pursue happiness for its own sake. Pour some slop into the trough and watch them go. And boy, he thought the British were dumb pigs. Dumb and boring. And Nietzsche was the kind of guy who thought that calling someone boring was as bad as calling them a child torturer. Nietzsche was also a humanities guy. Bentham and his fellow English psychologists were science guys. They were adherents of what you may remember from the philosophy of religion lecture I called scientism. This belief that science can tell us literally everything that there is to know about everything. So these guys believed in the power of reason and induction. Nietzsche believed in the power of poetry and history and music. And he believed a moral theory that ignored the history of morals was DOA, okay, dead on arrival. So he gave us a history of morality. It is, of course, a history that favors Nietzsche's own pet conclusions, but he doesn't try and hide that. History's messy, and any grand historical narratives or stories are, of necessity, ones that we impose on history with the benefit of hindsight. It doesn't exist in history, right? These are just interpretations of historical events. And as Nietzsche says at one point, there are no truths, only interpretations. So, ever the consistent relativist, Nietzsche acknowledges the fact that this account favors his own conclusions. And he takes a stance where he's like, is my theory true? Well, maybe, but it doesn't really matter. What matters is it useful? Is it useful for life? And this is one way in which Nietzsche differs drastically from previous thinkers. Despite being German, he is in many ways, I think, the godfather of American pragmatism. If you remember pragmatism from my lecture on skepticism and truth, Nietzsche doesn't care all that much if his historical account corresponds to reality in some one-on-one sense. What he wants is his account to be useful for us when we start creating new and, in his mind, healthy values. And we're going to have to do that any day now if we want to improve as a species, if Nietzsche's right. The thesis of Nietzsche's first essay can't be summed up in 7 words. But if it could, it might be good and evil versus good and bad. In fact, that is roughly the title of the first essay. In Nietzsche's account of things, the so-called master morality of the Greek nobility didn't distinguish between good and evil in the way we think of those terms. Instead, they distinguished between good and bad. And in the noble aristocratic ethics, if you could even call it that, you can think of these 2 words in terms that I think all of us as Ozarkers will understand. Hipster versus hillbilly. Now, if you find this dichotomy slightly offensive, as I do, then good. Nietzsche wants to offend you. He always wants to offend you because that's how he wakes you up. Or at least that's what he would say. So, the noble class, or hipsters, if you will, they're good in the good versus bad sense. They're hipsters. Okay, so they do what hipsters do. They sit around digging music, art, beauty, and just generally being above it all. Hillbillies are bad. For nobles, hipsters, bad is really just something, or really just everything, that good isn't. It's like the difference between good and bad music. Good music is catchy and melodic and innovative, and speaks to something deep in the human spirit. Bad music is meh. It's lame. It's stupid. It's not evil. It's just boring. And that's because good and bad in the whole, quote-unquote knightly framework are ultimately aesthetic judgments, not moral ones. What's an aesthetic judgment? Well, it's the kind of judgment that we make when we see a painting. Is the painting beautiful? Yes, well then it's good. Is it ugly? Unskilled? Well then it's bad. Bad, in other words, is just whatever isn't good. It's not some cosmic moral force in a constant battle with good. But what happens after the slave revolt in morality? Well, here's the thing. The so-called slave revolt in morality takes everything bad, okay, bad according to the nobles, everything that's humble, modest, subservient, plain, and says, wait a second, actually, these are all good things. And they're not good in the sense, of the noble sense of, I listened to some good music last night. Because after the slave revolt in morality, good becomes a moral phenomenon. And I think section 13 of the first essay explains this really well. But let us return. The problem of the other origin of the good as conceived by the man of ressentiment, demands its solution. That lambs dislike great birds of prey does not seem strange. Only it gives no grounds for reproaching these birds of prey for bearing off little lambs. And if the lambs say among themselves, these birds of prey are evil, whoever is least like a bird of prey, but rather its opposite, a lamb, would he not be good? There is no reason to find fault with this institution of an ideal, except perhaps that the birds of prey might view it a little ironically and say, well, we don't dislike them at all, these good little lambs. We even love them. I mean, nothing is more tasty after all than a tender lamb. Notice how the lambs, or the slaves or hillbillies, or I guess whatever most offends us, I suppose, the lambs frame good in terms that are entirely reactive. They don't define goodness in an active sense, like they don't invent it out of whole cloth. They don't invent new values, okay? But rather a reactive sense where they say, goodness is just everything the hipsters aren't. They think they're better than us? No, we're the good ones. And we're good in a more important sense. We're good in a moral sense. Meanwhile, the birds of prey, the hipsters, are still calling the hillbilly lambs good by noble standards. That is to say, by aesthetic standards. They're not saying the lambs are morally good. They're saying that they're good in the sense that they taste good. They are aesthetically pleasing to the senses, specifically the sense of taste. And then there's evil, which is, yet again, defined reactively by the hillbilly lambs. It's just everything the hipsters call good. But it's not merely a reversal of good and bad. It's a change in their very nature, okay? Because evil is different from bad. Bad was just kind of parasitic on good, right? In the noble conception. Bad was just whatever the good wasn't, right? But with the slave revolt in morality, on Nietzsche's account, evil becomes an equal and opposite force in the good-evil framework. Okay, the one that comes after the slave revolt in morality. So here, evil, as opposed to bad, like I just said, it's almost like an equal and opposite force to good. Or not really to good in the noble sense, but to the reimagined post-Judaic conception of good. And there, yeah, you see that? Backs me up totally. So, are hillbillies bad? That's the question, right? Well, yeah. The nobles would say we are. If we're all the things that hillbillies are so often accused of being, and the media and so on, we're uncultured, we're plain, we're miserly, and we wouldn't know good art if it slapped us in the face. But you know what? Hillbillies or slaves or whatever you want to call them, they conquered the entire world with this new value system. Judaism became Christianity, and then it took over half the globe. Then Islam comes along, it splits off from Christianity, And it takes over even more of the globe, to the point where today it is fair to say that our entire worldview is dependent on this initial Jewish reversal of values. So no, hillbillies are not stupid. In fact, they are supremely clever. They are the reason that we have philosophy. I'm not joking. This is Nietzsche is totally sold on this. They are the reason we have philosophy. And this is really the point at which all of the far right, Nazi type readers of Nietzsche seem to stop reading. They just assume that he is on the side of master morality and that everything hillbilly sucks. And then, of course, they always equate master morality with, white morality or Aryan morality or whatever. It's kind of funny how that works, right? But that isn't it at all. Nietzsche doesn't look back on master morality with this sense of nostalgia. I mean, okay, maybe a little. But that is by no means the sort of primary thing that he's doing. Nietzsche wants to create new values. In fact, he wants everyone to create their own set of new values. Each individual. I mean, as I mentioned before, he's fiercely individualistic. And he wants these new values to be ones that aren't merely parasitic on Judeo-Christian values or on noble values. So, I mean, going back to the question of, stupidity. In reality, if anyone's dumb, it's the hipsters. I mean, what do they do? What are they good for? What do they do? They just sit around all day like, Buzz Killington, seeking higher pleasures and looking at etchings.
So far, you're a bigger buzzkill than Buzz Killington. Oh, man, this is the best party I've ever been to.
Evening, everyone. I thought it would be very droll if we all sat down and looked at etchings. Would you like to join me, Peter?
Well, we're kind of partying here.
Good. Hold this up. Now, here's a fellow attempting to ride a bicycle. But he's having some trouble, isn't he? Would you like to know why?
Why?
Because he's a Scot. Now, who here likes a good story about a bridge?
Ah.
And if we're going to beat this hillbilly metaphor until it's dead, and we absolutely will, I'm going to mention one of my favorite films of the past few years, Tucker and Dale versus Evil. Hopefully you've all seen this already. And if you haven't, you really should, as assuming you can stomach some comic gore. But in the film, Tucker and Dale are hillbillies whom all the clever, or not clever, actually dumb, rich kids think are stupid. But the thing is that Tucker and Dale aren't actually stupid. Okay, well, maybe Tucker is. I think he's the guy on the right. But they're resourceful and even clever. And in a way, it is, I think, the ultimate sort of slave morality movie in a good way. I mean, it depicts, I think, obviously it doesn't depict slave morality. It's not that deep, but I think it depicts it in a way, unintentionally, that Nietzsche maybe would have liked it to have been depicted, which is depicting it in really all its glory, as well as its sort of lamer aspects, as he might say. Anyway, it's just a brilliant and hilarious film, and yeah, I just wanted to work that in there. So I hope you found this quick stroll through all the ins and outs of the genealogy of morals helpful. It is not intended to be anything but introductory, because I really want you to get all this information, as much as possible at least, from the text. It is a really subtle read and an important read that I think really needs to be understood by reading it, and not just listening to me talk about it. But I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was useful, and I hope you will maybe, find more Nietzsche to read, or, you know, or don't, right? I mean, if I'm speaking as a Nietzschean, I just want you to do you, man. All right? I will see you on Tuesday.